Vlad. Moscow Courier. While you watch my real life, the streets, the deliveries, everything, listen to today's story. Why Russians never say thank you to strangers, and why the answer will completely change how you see every interaction on these streets. Subscribe. Let's go. There is a moment that happens to almost every foreigner who spends time in Moscow. They hold a door open for someone. The person walks through, and nothing happens. No thank you, no nod, no acknowledgement of any kind. The person simply continues walking as if the door opened by itself, as if the foreigner holding it does not exist in any socially relevant sense. And the foreigner stands there for a moment with a specific feeling that they cannot quite name. Not quite offense, not quite confusion. Something between the two. A sense that a social script they have always followed has just been performed in front of an audience that does not recognize the script and is not participating in it. The door was held. The thank you did not come. Something feels wrong. But nothing is wrong. What happened is simply that two different understandings of what holding a door means and what it requires in response have just encountered each other. And neither side knows quite what to do with the encounter. I hold doors for people every day. I deliver packages and I navigate buildings and I move through a city of 12 million people, and the door holding and the not thanking happen constantly around me. I grew up in this. I did not notice it until someone from outside pointed at it and asked me what it meant. And then I started paying attention, and I realized that the not thanking is not random. It is not rudeness in the sense of a deliberate decision to withhold something that is owed. It is the expression of a specific and coherent understanding of what public interactions between strangers are and what they require. An understanding that is different from the American understanding, but that makes complete sense within its own logic. The first thing to understand is what thank you actually means in Russian culture as opposed to what it means in American culture. In American culture, thank you is a social lubricant. It smooths interactions. It acknowledges the other person. It maintains the pleasant surface of public life. Americans say thank you constantly, to cashiers, to people who hold doors, to people who move slightly out of the way on the sidewalk, to strangers who hand them something they dropped. The frequency of American thank you is so high that the word has become partly detached from its literal meaning. When you say thank you 40 times a day to strangers, you are not 40 times a day expressing genuine gratitude. You are performing a social ritual that keeps interactions comfortable and maintains the fiction of warmth between people who do not know each other and will never see each other again. The thank you in this context is not about gratitude. It is about social maintenance, about keeping the surface of public life pleasant and friction-free. Russian culture is skeptical of this kind of social maintenance, not because Russians do not value pleasant interactions, but because Russian culture places a specific value on the authenticity of what is expressed. If you say something, it should mean something. If you thank someone, it should be because you are actually grateful, not because the social script requires you to produce a thank you every time a specific kind of interaction occurs. The Russian understanding of thank you is that it is a real expression of real gratitude for something that genuinely merits gratitude. Not a social token, not a ritual phrase, a real communication about a real feeling. And this understanding means that the threshold for when thank you is appropriate is higher in Russian culture than in American culture. Not infinitely higher, but meaningfully higher. Holding a door for someone in Russian culture is not an act that rises to the level of requiring gratitude. It is a small practical accommodation between two people navigating a shared physical space. You are going through the door anyway. The person behind you is also going through the door. You happen to be slightly ahead. You hold it briefly so it does not close in their face. This is not a significant act of generosity. It is a minor practical coordination. A thank you for this minor practical coordination would be, in Russian social understanding, slightly disproportionate, slightly theatrical, like thanking someone for stepping slightly to the left so you can pass on the sidewalk. The coordination happened. Both parties benefited. Moving on. This does not mean that Russians never thank strangers. They do. But the threshold is calibrated differently. If a stranger goes significantly out of their way to help you, if they spend real time or real effort, if they do something that genuinely required them to sacrifice something for your benefit, then thank you is not just appropriate, but expected. And it is meant. When a Russian says thank you to a stranger, it carries more weight than the American version precisely because it is said less often. The currency of Russian gratitude has not been inflated by constant circulation. When it is spent, it means something. The concept that underlies all of this is the Russian distinction between formal obligation and genuine relationship. In Russian culture, many of the social rituals that American culture treats as universal obligations, thank you for service, please when asking for something, excuse me when passing, are understood differently depending on the context. These phrases in American culture create a kind of universal social warmth that applies equally to all interactions regardless of the relationship between the parties. In Russian culture, the level of social warmth that is expressed is calibrated to the actual relationship. Strangers get efficiency. People you know get warmth. The thank you that you give to a cashier who has just performed their professional function and been paid for it is a different thing from the thank you you give to a friend who has done something genuinely helpful. Russian culture does not pretend these are the same thing. American culture, through the universal application of thank you, creates a performance of equivalence that Russian culture finds slightly dishonest. The service industry dimension of this is particularly visible and particularly confusing for foreigners. In Russia, a cashier who does not thank you for your purchase and does not wish you a good day and does not perform the script of pleasant service interaction is not being rude in the Russian understanding. They are doing their job. You came. You bought something, they processed the transaction is complete. Warmth was not part of the transaction. Warmth is for relationships, not for transactions. The American service industry has created an expectation of performed warmth in every commercial interaction. Russian service culture has not, and the absence of performed warmth is consistently read by American visitors as rudeness when it is actually just a different calibration of what service interactions are supposed to include. The history behind this calibration is important. Soviet service culture was famously cold. The cashier who did not make eye contact, the clerk who processed your request with visible indifference to your existence as a person, the service worker who was there to perform a function not to make you feel valued as a customer. This Soviet service coldness had specific causes. In a system where your job was guaranteed regardless of how you performed it and where the customer had no alternative supplier to go to, there was no incentive to perform warmth. Warmth was not economically necessary, so it was not performed. This Soviet legacy persisted in Russian service culture well beyond the Soviet period and is still visible in certain contexts today. It is one of the things that Russians who have spent time in Western countries notice most starkly when they return. The difference between service that performs warmth and service that does not. And Russians are divided in their response to this difference. Some find the Western performed warmth pleasant, even knowing it is performed. Others find it slightly exhausting. The effort of maintaining the warm performance in every interaction regardless of how you actually feel about it. The metro is the best laboratory for observing Russian stranger interaction norms, because it concentrates 12 million people into a system of tubes and platforms and trains, where physical proximity between strangers is unavoidable and constant. On a Moscow metro car during rush hour, you are standing close enough to the people around you to hear them breathe. You are moving together, stopping together, swaying together when the train accelerates and decelerates. You are in a physical intimacy with complete strangers that in other contexts would require significant relationship to justify. And through all of this, the social norm is neutrality, not hostility, not warmth. Neutrality. Everyone manages their own space. Everyone looks at their phone or at the space in front of them or at nothing in particular. Nobody performs warmth for the benefit of strangers who did not ask for it and do not need it. The train moves, the people move with it. The interactions that are necessary happen with efficiency. The interactions that are not necessary do not happen. Within this general neutrality, there are specific moments where help is given freely and without any of the social ritual that American culture would attach to the giving. An elderly person gets on the train. Someone stands up and offers their seat, not with a speech, not with a performance of generosity. They simply stand and gesture slightly toward the seat, and the transaction is complete. The elderly person sits. They may say thank you or they may not. The person who gave up the seat does not wait for the thank you. They have already moved to another part of the car. The help was given. The help was received. The interaction is over. What is notable about this is not the absence of social ritual around the giving. It is the speed and the completeness of it. The help was total. It required no negotiation. It produced no extended social interaction. It happened and was finished, and everyone continued with their journey. This pattern of complete practical help without social ritual is one of the most misunderstood aspects of Russian stranger interaction. The Russian who helps a stranger with something heavy does not need to be thanked. They helped because the help was needed, and they were capable of providing it. The thank you is not the point. The help is the point. And once the help is given, the interaction is complete. The American model of helping a stranger and then having a brief, warm social exchange about the helping, the "are you okay" and the "thank you so much" and the "of course, no problem," is not the Russian model. The Russian model is help given cleanly and completely, and then the resumption of the normal neutral stranger interaction that is the baseline of public life in Moscow. The gender dimension of Russian stranger interaction norms adds another layer of complexity that is worth understanding. Russian culture maintains certain traditional gender-based interaction norms that have largely disappeared from American public culture. Men give up seats for women on public transportation. Men hold doors for women not as a performance of social equality, but as an expression of a specific form of respect. Men help women with heavy things without being asked and without requiring thanks. These interactions happen with a naturalness that comes from a culture that has not subjected them to the same level of ideological scrutiny that American culture has applied to similar interactions. They are simply what you do. And they happen without the social ritual that surrounds them in other contexts because they are so embedded in the behavioral expectations of the culture that they require no acknowledgement. Of course you give up your seat. Of course you hold the door. Of course you carry the heavy thing. These are not notable acts requiring gratitude. They are basic behaviors that the culture expects of men in public spaces. The flip side of this is that Russian women do not feel obligated to thank men for these interactions in the way that American culture might expect. The interaction is expected. The man is meeting an expectation that the culture has placed on him. The woman receiving the seat or the held door is not receiving a gift. She is receiving something that is simply her due in the specific cultural logic of Russian public interaction. The thank you in this context would acknowledge the gift. But if it is not a gift but simply the expected behavior, then the thank you is not required. The woman who sits in the offered seat and does not thank the man who offered it is not being rude. She is participating in a cultural script where his offering and her accepting are both simply the correct performance of their respective roles. The children dimension of Russian stranger interaction is particularly interesting and is one of the places where the coldness of Russian stranger interaction most obviously and most completely disappears. Russians who will not make eye contact with adult strangers on the metro will make faces at babies, will smile at small children, will speak to children in the warm and engaged way that Russian adults reserve for their own circle of known people. A child is not a stranger in the relevant sense. A child is simply a child. And Russian culture has always understood children as occupying a different category from adult strangers. The child who approaches you on the street is not intruding. The child who makes eye contact with you on the metro is not performing a social transgression. They are a child. And you respond to them with the warmth that children everywhere receive from adults who are not actively hostile to human life. This is one of the most visible contradictions in Russian stranger interaction culture for people from outside. The same person who will not acknowledge you as an adult stranger will instantly and completely engage with the child you are carrying. The coldness is for adults. Children get warmth automatically. The elderly also occupy a special category in Russian stranger interaction. Not quite the warmth that children receive, but significantly more than other adult strangers receive. There is a specific respect for age in Russian culture that translates into interaction norms. You give up your seat for old people not because they asked, but because age deserves that accommodation. You help old people with things they struggle with not because they thank you for it, but because the help is simply the correct response to the situation. You speak to old people more warmly than to other strangers because the culture has placed them in a category that is slightly inside the circle of complete strangers. They are not your family. They are not your friends. But they are old. And that counts for something real in how you treat them. The foreigner exception is another interesting dimension of Russian stranger interaction. Russians who maintain complete neutrality toward Russian strangers often shift significantly when they realize they are interacting with a foreigner. The foreigner is interesting. The foreigner is a curiosity. The foreigner is someone who has come from somewhere that is not here and who is navigating a city that is not their own, and who therefore has a specific need that the Russian stranger can meet. Russians who speak any English at all will often deploy it enthusiastically in service of a foreigner who is clearly lost or confused. Will spend significant time helping someone who does not speak Russian find what they are looking for. Will draw maps. Will walk the foreigner part of the way to their destination. Will do things for a foreign stranger that they would not do for a Russian stranger in the same situation. This is not inconsistency. It is the specific Russian understanding of when help is genuinely needed versus when it is merely convenient. The Russian stranger on the street does not need your help. They live here. They know where things are. The foreigner genuinely needs your help. And that genuine need produces a genuine response. The professional context produces a third variant of Russian interaction norms. In a professional context, Russians are significantly warmer and more formally polite than in random stranger interaction. Please and thank you are used more consistently in professional interactions. The social rituals of polite professional exchange are observed. Meetings begin with handshakes and pleasantries. Emails include appropriate formal language. The difference between the coldness of random stranger interaction and the formality of professional interaction is significant enough that foreigners who have only experienced Russians in professional contexts are often surprised by Russian public behavior, and foreigners who have only experienced Russians in public are often surprised by Russian professional behavior. The two contexts produce such different performances of the same culture that they can seem like two different cultures entirely. The deeper explanation for why Russians do not thank strangers requires going beyond the surface of cultural norms and into the specific historical and philosophical soil from which those norms grew. Russian culture has been shaped by a specific set of historical experiences that produced a specific understanding of what public life is and what it requires from the people who participate in it. Understanding these experiences is not necessary for interacting successfully with Russians in public. But it is necessary for understanding why the interaction norms are what they are, rather than something else. Why this specific calibration of public warmth and public neutrality, rather than another calibration. The communal living of the Soviet era is one of the most important historical factors. The kommunalka, the communal apartment where multiple families shared a kitchen and a bathroom and a corridor, was the dominant form of urban housing in Moscow for much of the Soviet period. Families who had no connection to each other and no choice in the matter shared the most intimate spaces of daily life. The morning kitchen, the bathroom at 7 in the morning, the corridor at midnight. Proximity was imposed, not chosen, and the management of imposed proximity required a specific kind of social technology, the technology of managed distance. The ability to be physically close to people you did not choose to be close to without the proximity creating false intimacy or intolerable friction. The communal apartment produced a culture of careful neutrality in imposed proximity. You were polite, you were civil, you did not create problems, but you also did not perform warmth that was not real. Because the performance of warmth in a relationship of imposed proximity, where warmth was not actually felt, would have been exhausting and dishonest and ultimately unsustainable. The neutrality was not coldness. It was the sustainable management of a situation that required sustainable management. This kommunalka psychology extended into public life. The metro car is a kommunalka in motion. The public space of Moscow is a kommunalka at city scale. The managed distance that Soviet communal living required became the baseline of Russian public interaction, not because everyone had lived in a kommunalka, but because the cultural technology that the kommunalka produced was useful in all the contexts where people were brought into proximity with strangers they had not chosen, which is to say in all the contexts of urban public life: the metro, the queue, the shop, the park. All of these are spaces where proximity is imposed, and where the management of that proximity requires the same technology that the kommunalka required: civility without false warmth, efficiency without performance, the interaction that is necessary happening cleanly, and the interaction that is not necessary not happening at all. The queue is a specific institution of Soviet and post-Soviet public life that deserves particular attention in the context of stranger interaction norms. Soviet queues were long, sometimes very long. Sometimes the queue was for something specific. Sometimes the queue was for whatever was at the end of it, which you would discover when you got there. You stood in a queue with strangers for extended periods. You had no choice about this. The queue was how things worked, and the management of the queue required a specific social technology. You established your place. You held your place. You monitored the people ahead of you and behind you with the careful attention of someone who knows that their position in the queue is their only resource, and that losing it means starting again. This queue culture produced a specific form of stranger interaction: focused, territorial, attentive to position and rights without being warm. The person behind you in the queue is not your friend. They are a competitor for a position that you currently hold. Warmth in this context would be strategic confusion. Clarity about your position and theirs is what the situation requires. The post-Soviet period changed the queue, but did not eliminate the psychology it produced. Modern Russian public life has far fewer queues of the Soviet type. The shops are full. The services are available. You do not usually stand for hours waiting for something that may or may not be there when you reach the front. But the psychology of public interaction that the queue produced persists. The sense that public space is a shared resource that everyone has a legitimate claim to, and that navigating it requires attention to your own position and rights without excessive concern for the comfort of the strangers around you. Not hostility, just the clear-eyed management of shared space by people who understand that shared space requires management and that performing warmth does not contribute to the management. The religious and philosophical traditions of Russian culture also contribute something to the understanding of why performed warmth is valued less than authentic expression. The Russian Orthodox tradition has a specific understanding of authenticity and performance that runs through Russian culture in ways that are not always explicit, but that are nonetheless real. The tradition values inner truth over outer performance, the prayer that is felt over the prayer that is merely said, the love that is expressed in action over the love that is expressed in words. This tradition produces a cultural skepticism of performance for its own sake, of doing or saying things not because they are true, but because they create a pleasant social surface. The thank you that is said not because you are grateful, but because the script requires it is a small performance. And Russian culture inherited from its religious tradition a specific discomfort with small performances that substitute for truth. Tolstoy wrote about this. Dostoevsky wrote about this. The great Russian literary tradition is full of characters who are destroyed by the gap between their inner life and their outer performance, who suffer from the inauthenticity of saying what is expected rather than what is felt, who find in genuine human connection the only relief from the performed interactions that the social world requires. This literary tradition both reflects and reinforces the cultural value placed on authenticity over performance. Russians who have read Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, which is to say most educated Russians, have been repeatedly shown through narrative what the cost of inauthenticity is, and what the value of genuine human connection is. And the cultural preference for authentic interaction over performed interaction has been reinforced through this literary tradition across generations. The specific experience of foreigners who spend extended time in Russia almost always includes a moment of breakthrough. a moment when the neutrality of Russian-stranger interaction suddenly resolves into something completely different. When a Russian who has been interacting with you with complete neutrality for weeks or months suddenly drops the neutrality and becomes genuinely warm and genuinely engaged and genuinely interested in you as a person. This moment is often described as one of the most striking social experiences that Russia provides, because the contrast is so complete. The neutrality was so consistent and so thorough that the warmth that replaces it feels like a different person has appeared. The same face, the same voice, completely different register of human engagement. This breakthrough moment is the moment when you cross from stranger to known person in the Russian social understanding. When enough time has passed and enough consistent interaction has occurred that the Russian has decided you are worth the warmth that they reserve for people they have chosen. It does not happen at a specific moment that can be identified in advance. It happens when it happens. And when it happens, it is complete and immediate, in a way that is startling if you have not been told to expect it. The neutrality ends. The warmth begins. And the warmth that begins is total in the way that Russian warmth is always total when it is real. Not performed, not calibrated to social expectation, real, complete, without reservation. This is the thing that the thank you culture misses. The American model of universal performed warmth creates a pleasant surface that is consistent and reliable, and that never goes below a certain level of niceness, but it also never goes above a certain level of genuine depth. The Russian model creates a neutral surface that is consistent in its own way, and that can feel cold and unwelcoming to people who are used to the American surface. But beneath that neutral surface, available to the people who earn access to it, is a depth of genuine warmth and genuine engagement that the performed American warmth rarely reaches. You cannot have both. The performance that maintains the pleasant surface uses up the energy that the genuine depth requires. Russian culture chose the depth over the surface, and the price of that choice is the neutral face that foreigners read as coldness, and that is actually just the door. The door that opens when you knock on it long enough and consistently enough and honestly enough that the person inside decides you are worth letting in. I ride through this city every day. I see the neutral faces. I know what is behind them because I grew up here and I have been let through enough doors to know what is on the other side. The most generous people you will never meet, hidden behind the face that protects them, available to the people who are patient enough to find them. The thank you that is not said to strangers is not the absence of gratitude. It is the conservation of something real for the people who have earned it. Subscribe if you want to keep seeing Moscow through my camera. Come back next week. There is always more. And leave me a comment. Does your culture perform warmth or reserve it? I read every single one.